The first thing my son-in-law said when the will reading began was loud enough to carry through the entire conference room. He's just a burned-out firefighter who never amounted to anything. Why are we even pretending this takes long? Nobody laughed. Nobody agreed out loud either. But nobody corrected him. 12 people sitting around a polished mahogany table in a downtown Atlanta law office, and every single one of them just stared at the carpet like they'd suddenly found it fascinating. I remember looking at my daughter across that table, 31 years old, wearing a gray blazer I didn't recognize, sitting beside her husband like she was hoping I wouldn't notice she hadn't disagreed with him. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Then I looked at the attorney. He was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a yellow legal pad in front of him. He'd been reaching for his pen when my son-in-law spoke. His name was Gibson, Walter Gibson. And the moment he looked up from that legal pad and really saw my face, everything changed. "Walter," I said quietly, "it's been a long time." The pen stopped moving. He leaned forward slightly, squinting across the table like he thought the fluorescent lights were playing tricks on him. Then the color drained completely out of his face. He stood up. Not slowly, not professionally. He just stood straight up from his chair the way a man does when his body reacts before his brain catches up. "Ray Hutchins," he whispered. My son-in-law's expression shifted immediately. His name was Brandon. He'd spent the last 10 minutes talking over me to my daughter like I wasn't in the room. Now his eyes moved back and forth between the attorney and me with something that looked a lot like the beginning of panic. "What is this?" he asked carefully. Nobody answered him. Walter Gibson set his pen down on the legal pad very deliberately, straightened his jacket. Then he looked around the room with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 30 years deciding how meetings went. "We're going to take a short recess," he said. Brandon started to object. Walter raised one hand without even looking at him, and Brandon sat back down like a scolded kid at a school desk. I followed Walter down a narrow hallway lined with framed citations and black and white photographs of Atlanta in earlier decades. The building smelled like old paper and recycled air, and the particular kind of quiet that collects in places where people argue about money all day. His office, at the end of the hall, was smaller than I expected. Bookshelves floor to ceiling, a rubber plant in the corner that had seen better days, a photograph of Stone Mountain on the wall behind his desk, and on the credenza beside the window, a small ceramic firefighter's helmet, red, cracked along one side, sitting on a wooden base. I hadn't seen that helmet in 22 years. The moment the door closed behind us, Walter just stood there in the middle of the room looking at me. Then he shook his head slowly, the way men do when something doesn't quite fit inside ordinary language. "I looked for you," he said, "after the hospital. I looked for you for a long time." I sat down in one of the chairs across from his desk. My knees appreciated it. "I transferred to a different station," I said. "Then I retired. Life has a way of moving." He sat down across from me, but not behind the desk. He pulled the other chair around and sat maybe 4 feet away, which surprised me. Lawyers usually like the desk between them and the rest of the world. But Walter Gibson apparently hadn't forgotten certain things about himself. "Do you remember what you said to me?" he asked. "In the stairwell." I looked at the ceramic helmet on the credenza. "More or less. You said, 'Don't you let go of that railing.'" He paused. "I've thought about that sentence probably 10,000 times. To explain how we ended up in that room together, I need to go back to the summer of 2001. I grew up in Macon, Georgia, in a neighborhood where the houses were close enough together that you could hear your neighbors' arguments through the kitchen window. My father worked at a paper mill his entire adult life. My mother cleaned houses for families on the north side of town. Neither of them ever once suggested I aim for anything in particular, which I think was their way of leaving the door open. I joined the Atlanta Fire Department at 24, not because of some dramatic calling, mostly because my cousin Darnell was already on the job, and he said the work was honest and the benefits were real. Both things turned out to be true. I served 26 years, Station 19, then Station 7, then back to 19 again. Most of it I don't talk about at dinner tables. There are things you see work in a fire that simply don't translate into conversation without making everyone around you go quiet in a way that makes the meal uncomfortable. So you learn to carry them separately in a compartment you don't open in public. I met my wife, Catherine, at a church picnic in Decatur in 1988. She was laughing at something her sister said, and I remember thinking her laugh was the most uncomplicated thing I'd encountered in a long time. We were married 11 months later. We had our daughter Renee in 1993, and for many years we were exactly as happy as two imperfect people trying to build something real can be. The fire that changed everything happened on a Thursday night in August. An office building on Peachtree Road, 14 stories, a construction defect in the electrical system on the 6th floor. By the time our units arrived, floors 7 through 10 were already compromised. I won't describe everything from that night. Some of it I've spent 22 years trying to arrange into something manageable. What I'll say is this. On the 9th floor, after the main stairwell had already been cut off, I found a man in a storage room who had broken his ankle trying to climb out a window. He was 33 years old, heavy-set, terrified, and still carrying a leather briefcase like part of his brain, hadn't caught up to the situation yet. The secondary stairwell was on the far side of the floor, past 2 rooms already filling with smoke. His ankle couldn't support weight. I half-carried him down, 3 flights in gear that added another 45 pounds to my frame, through a stairwell so hot, the handrail scorched through my gloves. He held on to that railing at every landing. I kept telling him, don't let go, don't stop moving, just keep holding on. We made it out 40 seconds before that stairwell collapsed behind us. The man with the briefcase was Walter Gibson. He was a junior attorney at the time, working late on a contract dispute nobody would remember a week later. I never followed up after the hospital. That wasn't something I did. You do the job, you move on. The next call is already coming in. You don't linger, but Walter apparently lingered. In his office that afternoon, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a manila folder that had clearly been handled many times over the years. The edges were soft with age. He set it on the desk between us without opening it immediately. People came to my office, he said. Over the years, firefighters you worked with, people from your old neighborhood. I was trying to find a way to thank you properly. I looked at the folder. That wasn't necessary. It was to me. He opened it then. Inside were letters, handwritten notes, printed emails, a few newspaper clippings. One from a woman whose house I'd pulled her 2 kids out of back in 2006. One from a retired battalion chief who wrote about the 3 younger firefighters I'd mentored through their first years on the job. One was a card, child's handwriting, crayon drawing of a fire truck, signed by a 6-year-old named Marcus, whose name I had to think about before I placed it. The kitchen fire on Glenwood Avenue. His mother had carried him out in a laundry basket when the smoke detector woke her. We'd arrived 2 minutes later. Marcus was 7 now. Or 20-something, I supposed. Time does what it does. I looked away from the letters. You kept all of this, I said. I did. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Walter said something that settled somewhere deep in my chest. The conference room out there thinks today is about an inheritance, he said quietly. But I think it might actually be about something else. He was right. And I think we both knew it. But to explain what brought me to that conference room in the first place, I need to go back a little further. Catherine died 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. There is no kind way to say that, and I won't try to find one. She was 63 years old, and she was still the person I called first. When anything happened, good or bad, and then suddenly, she wasn't there anymore. And I learned that grief doesn't follow any schedule you can plan around. After she died, I moved from the house in Decatur we'd shared for 28 years into a smaller place in Smyrna, closer to Renee. That had seemed like a good idea at the time. Renee had married Brandon 3 years before Catherine got sick. Brandon sold commercial real estate in Buckhead. He drove a black Escalade and wore shirts with the top 2 buttons open and had opinions about wine that he shared whether or not anyone had asked. I tried to like him. I want to be honest about that. I made a real effort for the better part of 4 years. But some people decide what you are very early and then they never update the file. To Brandon, I was always just the old retired fireman. A little rough around the edges. Drove a used Tacoma. Didn't own anything impressive. Spent my afternoons volunteering at the fire station auxiliary and my evenings watching baseball. When Renee's friends came over for dinner, I noticed Brandon had a way of steering conversations away from me. Like he was embarrassed by the possibility that someone might ask me a direct question, and I might answer it in a way that reminded people I existed. It was Catherine's brother James, who passed away that spring. James had been a widower for 11 years, no children, and he'd left a modest estate split between Renee and me. Nothing extravagant. A small house in Marietta he'd owned outright, a savings account, a few personal items of value. James had been a quiet, decent man his entire life, and he'd spent his money carefully, the way people who grew up without much tend to do. Brandon had apparently already decided how he felt about all of it before the reading even began. He'd made 2 phone calls during the drive to the attorney's office. I was in the back seat. He didn't lower his voice. "It's going to be a waste of time," he told someone on the other end. The old man probably left them both a lawnmower and a fishing rod. Rennie stared out the passenger window and didn't say anything. I stared out the rear window and didn't say anything either. But something went cold and quiet inside me that morning that didn't quite thaw back out. When Walter and I walked back into the conference room together, the entire table went still. Not ordinary quiet. The kind of silence that happens when people sense the gravity in a room has shifted and they haven't figured out yet which way things are going to fall. Brandon looked from Walter to me and back again with visible calculation happening behind his eyes. He was a man who was very good at reading rooms. He could tell something had changed. He just couldn't tell what. Renee looked at me for the first time that morning without immediately looking away. Brandon recovered fast. He always did. "Mr. Gibson," he said with the particular tone of a man who's decided to reassert himself, "I hope we can proceed. Some of us have afternoon commitments." Walter sat back down at the head of the table and adjusted his reading glasses without hurrying. "We'll proceed when I'm ready, Mr. Corbin." Brandon's jaw tightened slightly. The reading resumed. James's estate divided, as the will specified, clean and clear. The Marietta house to Renee, the savings to me, a small bequest to a local veterans organization. James had quietly supported for years, without telling anyone. Brandon said nothing through the financial portion, but I could see him calculating, running numbers, adjusting his expression as each item was read. Then Walter did something that wasn't in the document. He set the will aside, removed his reading glasses, and looked around the table. "Before we conclude," he said, "I want to say something that's outside my formal role here, but that I believe is appropriate." Brandon sat straighter. "I have known Ray Hutchins for 22 years, Walter said. "He doesn't know I've known him that long, because he's the kind of man who does what needs doing and then gets out of the way. That is both his greatest strength and the reason people like me have to speak up occasionally." The room was very quiet. In 2001, I was inside a burning building on Peachtree Road, and I was not going to make it out. This man carried me down 3 flights of stairs through conditions I'm not going to describe in polite company, and he never once told me his name until someone on the sidewalk called out to him. Walter paused. "I have spent 22 years trying to find an adequate way to acknowledge that. I have not found one, but I want the people in this room to understand who they're sitting across from." He put his reading glasses back on and looked down at his legal pad. "That's all," he said simply. "We're adjourned." Brandon didn't say anything, which, in my experience with that man, was the loudest thing he ever said. The parking garage beneath the building was cool and dim and smelled like exhaust and concrete. I was unlocking my truck when I heard footsteps behind me. Renee. She was still holding her copy of the will documents against her chest, both arms wrapped around them like she needed something to hold on to. She looked younger standing there than she did at the table. She always did when the performance of being someone's wife fell away for a moment, and she was just my daughter again. "Dad," she said. I turned around. She stopped a few feet away. Behind her, through the garage opening, I could hear downtown Atlanta doing what Atlanta always does. moving fast and loud and without much regard for anyone standing still inside it. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked. "Tell you what?" "About the fire, about the building, about any of it." I leaned against the truck. My lower back appreciated the support. "Because it was just a call," I said. "There were thousands of calls. That's not an answer. It's an honest one." She looked down at the concrete. "Walter Gibson is one of the most respected attorneys in the city." "I didn't know that." "Brandon's been trying to get a meeting with him for 2 years." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say. Renee pressed her lips together. "Brandon is going to be difficult when we get home." "He's usually difficult," I said gently. She made a sound that was almost a laugh but wasn't quite. "He's going to say Walter was biased. He's going to say the whole thing should be reviewed. He can say that. Doesn't that bother you?" I thought about it honestly. Not as much as it probably should. She finally looked at me directly. Really looked the way she hadn't done in the conference room, maybe hadn't done in longer than that. "I didn't stop him," she said quietly. "When he said that, about you being burned out, not amounting to anything, I didn't say a word." Rain had started outside the garage opening. Light rain, the kind Atlanta gets in early October before the temperature finally decides to drop. "I know," I said. "I don't have an excuse for that. I'm not asking for one." "I know you're not." Her voice was getting unsteady. "That's almost worse." I waited. "Mom would have said something," Renee said finally. Yes, I agreed. She would have. That sat between us in the concrete quiet for a moment. Then she said the thing she'd really come down to the garage to say. "I found some boxes when we cleared the Decatur house. After Mom died." She swallowed. "Boxes I didn't open right away. I finally opened them last month. I had a feeling I knew which boxes. The commendations," she said. "The incident reports. The letters from families." She stopped. "Dad." There were 11 letters. "People are generous when something goes right," I said. "There was a letter from a city councilman. There was a letter from a family in East Atlanta who named their son after you." I looked at the oil-stained concrete. "His name is Raymond," she said. "He's 15 now. His mother wrote every year for 3 years to find an address for you." I hadn't known about the yearly letters. Catherine had handled the mail in those years when I was working nights. "Why didn't you ever tell me any of this?" Renee asked, and her voice cracked on the last word. I leaned back against the truck and took a slow breath. "When you were little," I said, "I used to drive home after bad calls and sit in the driveway for a few minutes before coming inside, so I could put the lid back on whatever I'd brought home with me that night. So you and your mother wouldn't have to carry it." She was crying now, quietly. "I think somewhere along the way," I continued, "putting the lid on became the only thing I knew how to do. Even when there was nothing bad to seal away. Even when there was good that deserved to be said out loud." Rennie wiped her face with the back of her hand, a gesture she'd had since she was 4 years old. "I stopped defending you," she said, "to his friends. To mine. After a while, I started just not correcting people when they made assumptions." "What kind of assumptions?" "That you were just," she gestured vaguely, "ordinary." I looked at her for a long moment. "I am ordinary." "No," she said firmly, "you're not." And I let myself forget that because it was easier than fighting Brandon every time he decided to dismiss you. The rain picked up outside. Cars moved through the gray afternoon beyond the garage opening. "I need you to know," she said carefully, "that I'm going to figure some things out." I understood what she meant, and I didn't push it. Some conversations have to happen in their own time, and a parking garage in downtown Atlanta after a will reading isn't the right room for all of them. "Your mother used to say the same thing," I said after a moment, "right before she actually did it." Renee made that almost law again, and this time it was a little closer to the real thing. 3 months after the will reading, I found a routine I recognized as manageable. I was renting a small house in Smyrna by then, just under 1,000 square feet. Back deck looking out over a stand of pine trees that turned gold in November. The neighborhood was quiet. An older street. People walked dogs in the mornings and waved without stopping to talk, which suited me fine. I slept better than I had in years. Not every night, and not without interruption, but better. Some of what lives in a man after decades of this kind of work doesn't fully leave. I'd made peace with that. The trick is learning which parts of the noise you have to respect and which parts you're allowed to set down. I volunteered 3 mornings a week at the Atlanta Fire Foundation, a nonprofit that helped firefighters and their families navigate injury claims, survivor benefits, and a VA system that often required someone who understood bureaucratic labyrinths to help people find their way through. A lot of retired firefighters got lost in those systems. Some of them just needed someone to sit with them and help them fill out the right form. Some of them needed someone who remembered what the job actually felt like and wouldn't make them explain every silence. One Tuesday in late November, I was helping a retired lieutenant named Dwight work through a disability appeal when the door to the foundation office opened and I looked up. Brandon walked in alone. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking around the small office. The second-hand furniture, the filing cabinets, the hand-painted banner on the wall that read "Those who serve deserve someone" in their corner. He was wearing a blazer but no tie, which for Brandon counted as casual. I waited. He walked to the chair across from my desk and sat down without being invited. That, at least, was consistent. "Renee doesn't know I'm here," he said. "All right." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the surface of the desk between us. He was a man who was usually very comfortable controlling the pace of conversations, and he wasn't comfortable right now. I could see him calculating which version of himself to offer. Finally, he said, "Gibson called me, Walter." He called to clarify that his remarks at the reading were personal and not a reflection on the professional neutrality of his firm. Brandon paused. Then he spent about 10 minutes telling me things about you that I didn't know. He didn't have to do that. He clearly wanted to. He looked up. "Did you really carry him down 3 flights in a burning building?" "That's not exactly how I'd describe it." "How would you describe it?" I thought about the stairwell, the sound of the structure moving around us, the weight of another human being depending entirely on the decision your body makes in the next 10 seconds. "I'd describe it as doing the job," I said. Brandon looked at the desk again. "He told me about the letters, the families." I didn't respond. "He told me you paid for a kid's funeral out of pocket in 2009. Firefighter who died on the job, young guy, family had nothing." I'd asked Catherine not to mention that to anyone. I thought she hadn't. "People talk," I said finally. Brandon was quiet for a long moment. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words came out stiffly, like they'd been rehearsed in the car and were still finding their shape. "What I said in that conference room was disrespectful and wrong." I looked at him. He met my eyes, which cost him something. I could tell. "All right," I said. "That's it?" He seemed faintly thrown off. "What did you want me to say?" "I don't know." He shifted in the chair. "Something angrier, maybe." "I'm 64 years old," I said. "I don't have extra energy for anger I don't need." He almost smiled. It didn't quite get there, but it was closer than anything I'd seen from him in 4 years of family holidays. "Renee is figuring things out," he said carefully. "She told me. He stopped. She's like her mother." "Yes," I said. "She is." That landed between us quietly. He stood up after a moment, straightening his jacket out of habit. He looked around the office one more time, at the banner, at the filing cabinet with the Atlanta Fire Department decal still stuck to the side of it from 1997. "For whatever it's worth," he said at the door, "I think what you do here matters." "It fills the hours," I said. He nodded once. Then he left. Dwight looked up from his paperwork after the door closed. He was 71 years old, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a rooftop collapse in 1998, and absolutely nobody's fool. "Who was that?" he asked. "My son-in-law." Dwight considered this. "He apologize?" "After a fashion." He went back to his paperwork. "Guess that's something." It was Renee's daughter, my granddaughter Addie, who ended up asking the question that stayed with me longest. Addie was 8. She had Catherine's eyes and her grandmother's habit of asking the second question that everyone else was thinking, but had the manners not to say out loud. She'd been at the Veterans Day ceremony at her elementary school in Marietta that December. The school held a small event every year. Folding chairs, construction paper decorations, A color guard from a local JROTC program. Not fancy. Honest, which is better. I was sitting in the back row. Renee on one side, Addie beside her fidgeting in the way of children who are trying very hard to be still. The principal called up a retired Army sergeant to speak. Then, a Navy veteran who'd served in the Gulf. Then, to my complete surprise, she said, "We also want to recognize a member of our school community whose grandfather served for 26 years with the Atlanta Fire Department. Addie, would you like to introduce him?" Addie launched out of her seat like she'd been waiting her entire life for this particular moment. She walked to the microphone with the absolute confidence of a child who has not yet learned self-consciousness, looked out over the gymnasium full of parents and students and folding chairs and said, "This is my Grandpa Ray. He saved a lot of people and he doesn't like to talk about it, but it's okay because I do." The gymnasium laughed. I put my hand over my face. Then people began to clap. Not the polite, rhythmic applause of obligation. Something warmer than that. Parents, teachers, kids who didn't even know me, just clapping because a small girl had said something true and simple, and the room had recognized it. I stood up because there wasn't anything else to do. Renee put her hand on my arm briefly as I moved past her. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Later, walking to the car, Addie held my hand and looked up at me with the direct expression that meant she had been holding a question in for a while and had decided it was time. "Grandpa," she said, "were you ever scared?" "Yes," I said, "pretty often." This surprised her. "Really?" "The ones who say they were never scared," I said, "are either lying or they weren't paying close enough attention." She thought about this seriously. "But you still went in. That's the job," I said. She was quiet for a moment, walking, thinking. "Is that what brave means?" she asked finally. "Going in even when you're scared?" I looked down at her. 8 years old, Catherine's eyes, the whole world still making sense in ways it gradually wouldn't. "That's one kind," I said. "There are others." "Like what?" "Like staying quiet when you're hurting so the people around you don't have to hurt too." I paused. "Or telling the truth even when it's easier not to." Addie considered this with great seriousness. "I think," she announced, "that you're good at the first kind and you need practice with the other ones." I laughed out loud. First real laugh and longer than I could exactly measure. "You sound like your grandmother," I told her. She grinned. "Mom says that too." That evening, Renee came by the house in Smyrna with leftover food from Thanksgiving that she said she didn't have room for in her refrigerator. This was not entirely true. She came because she wanted to check on me, and the food was a socially acceptable reason. She stayed for 2 hours. We sat on the back deck with the pine trees going dark around us and talked in the way we hadn't talked in several years. About Catherine. About the Decatur house and all the things inside it we'd both been reluctant to sort through. About the boxes with the commendations. About a 14-year-old boy in East Atlanta named Raymond, who apparently existed in part because of a night I barely remembered clearly anymore. At one point she said, "I want to write him a letter." Raymond's mother. "You don't have to do that." "I want to," she said firmly. "I want her to know that the person she was trying to reach isn't alone." I looked out at the pine trees. Stars were starting to show through the branches. "Your mother would have already written it," I said. "I know." She smiled, and there was grief in it and something else. Something that looked like resolution. "I'm a little behind schedule." A few weeks later, just before Christmas, Walter Gibson stopped by the foundation office unannounced. He was carrying a box from a bakery and a manila envelope, and he had the look of a man who had something to say and had worked out how to say it. We sat in the small conference room that the foundation used for family meetings. Walter set the bakery box on the table and the envelope beside it. "Retirement suits you," he said. "Some days," I said. "You want coffee?" "Please." I got us both coffee from the break room. When I came back, he had opened the envelope and was looking at something inside it. He passed it across the table to me. It was a photograph. 8 by 10, in a simple frame. Taken from street level looking up at a building, the Peachtree Road building. I recognized the architecture immediately, but the photograph was recent. The building had been renovated, the exterior refaced. Below the main entrance, set into the facade, was a small granite plaque. I leaned forward to read the text. In memory of the 14 people evacuated from this building on the night of August 23, 2001, and in recognition of the Atlanta Fire Department personnel who carried them out. I sat back. The building's ownership changed hands twice, Walter said. The new owners agreed to the plaque 3 years ago. I've been trying to get you a copy of this photograph ever since. He paused. Took me a while to find you. I looked at the photograph for a long time. 14 people, I said. 14. I hadn't known the exact number. You don't always know. The night is loud and fast and full of voices, and you move from one thing to the next because there isn't time to count. I only remember a few of them, I said honestly. That's all right, Walter said. They remember you. I keep the photograph on the mantle in the Smyrna house now. Beside a picture of Catherine taken at Tybee Island this summer before she got sick, and a crayon drawing Addie made of a fire truck with a small stick figure. Standing beside it, that she labeled Grandpa Ray, in letters that are slightly too big for the space available. 3 generations of things I didn't earn so much as accumulate, by showing up and doing what needed doing, and occasionally remembering to let people in. Peace is a quieter thing than I expected. It doesn't announce itself. It just starts to feel familiar. The way a room does, once you've lived in it long enough to stop noticing the walls. Some mornings I drive to the foundation office early, before anyone else arrives, and I make the coffee and unlock the door and sit for a few minutes in the quiet before the day begins, not thinking about anything in particular. Just sitting with the knowledge that the work matters, that the hours are honest. That somewhere in the city there is a 15-year-old boy named Raymond, who exists in full and doesn't know my name, and that is exactly how it should be. If this story made you think of someone, a first responder, a parent, a neighbor, somebody who carries more than they ever mention and asks for less than they deserve, I hope you'll find a moment to tell them they're seen. Because the people who spent their lives making sure everyone else got out safely are sometimes the last ones anyone thinks to check on. And they shouldn't have to wait for a conference room to find out that someone noticed.